Hello, everyone. Thank you all. Thank you, attendees, for joining us. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, our moderator, for joining us. My name is Monica Leininger. I work for Powder River Basin Resource Council, and I staff the Cheyenne Area Landowners Coalition, which is an affiliate of Powder River Basin Resource Council. This is our annual meeting, and we're really excited to have these experts here today where they will discuss air pollution from oil and gas and the impact on public health. The goal for this webinar is really to be educational and to learn about ongoing research that is driving policymaking in other states to tighten regulations on oil and gas operations. If you'd like to learn more about the Cheyenne Area Landowners Coalition or become a member, please visit our website at cheyennelandowners.org. That's a brand new website for us. We're really excited to share it. We have CALC's 2020 accomplishments on there, which there's a lot to celebrate. So check it out when you have the chance. So we have two speakers today and our moderator, Laramie County Commissioner Linda Heath. We will provide contact information and try to keep this an ongoing conversation. So moderator, Commissioner Linda Heath, I'll turn things over to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Commissioner Heath has been serving Laramie County since 2014. And we're really excited to have her today to bring a local perspective to Laramie County's oil and gas development. So the floor is yours, Commissioner Heath.
Well, in the interest of time and wanting to be a few words, which is something that I'm sure is unusual for a politician, this is my 6th year serving as commissioner here in Laramie County. We've seen a lot of things happen as far as the oil industry, oil and gas industry in this county. We have a little bit different animal as far as you all know, as in quite a bit of the exploration has happened near our subdivisions here in the county. We have now some exploration that is beginning to happen up north in the county and more of the ranch land. You hear a lot of rumors, but like politics, oil exploration seems to run on rumors many times. So with that, I think I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Robert Field. He is a senior research scientist at the University of Wyoming. He has over 30 years of experience measuring toxic air pollution. His PhD thesis was used to inform the establishment of the United Kingdom's National Ambient Air Quality Standards for benzene. In the late 1900s, he helped to develop the UK National Hydrocarbon Network, and in the 2000s, his air pollution work focused upon population exposure to air pollution while at the European Reference Laboratory of Air Pollution. In 2008, Field established a new research program to assess the emerging issue of wintertime ozone in Sublette County. This work, initially considering the scope of ozone episodes, developed to focus upon better understanding of oil and gas emissions. His research is currently focused upon defining baseline air quality conditions in Carbon County, Wyoming. And I'm sure you'll enjoy listening to him because he's got this delightful British accent. And with that, Dr. Field.
Well, at least I've got one thing going for me, my accent, for sure. Let's see how we go with the presentation tonight. So I'm just going to get my presentation up and let's get full screen and then hopefully play this from the start. Okay, so I guess what is my screen like is the first question. Monica, are you seeing all these little bits in the way, or is my screen relatively clear?
Nope, it looks great. We have your presentation up and we have your face. We turned off Dr. McKenzie's face until we introduced her, so it looks great.
Okay. Just I've got a lot of junk on the right side of my screen, just from the webinar stuff, so I'm going to leave that where it is. I don't think that's going to disturb me. Great, so thank you for the introduction, much appreciated. So I'm just going to get started pretty quickly here. The first thing I want to say is I am indeed a senior research scientist at the University of Wyoming, but tonight my views are my own. So I'm going to be presenting research that I've performed, and I'm hoping that I'm going to provide a little narrative for you surrounding, let's say, oil and gas emissions, how we should feel about them. And I'm really the warm-up guy for Lisa, who's going to be talking more about health effects. So what I'm aiming to really talk about is emissions and what we've come to understand in the recent years of work around this area. So let's get going. Well, the first thing is, how do we really know about the quality of the air we breathe? At the moment, let's say we can rely upon a lot of instrumentation, and you'll see monitors and you'll see lots of information, and but we can also use our senses in a subjective way. And we're probably doing this at the moment with the smoke that we're experiencing in Wyoming. So it kind of relies on our senses, relies on our perception. So you might have eye irritation, etc. So you kind of inherently know that the air is bad. And so that's important when we think about the public, and we have different levels of sensitivity. So one person may find the air, let's say, more challenging than another. So we have to sort of bear that in mind when we're thinking about air quality and thinking about impacts. And then we have an objective way we can think about air quality, and that requires measurement. So you're going to be seeing a lot of measurements that I'm going to be sharing with you today. And when we make measurements, usually we're trying to compare them to some kind of standard. I'm not going to talk too much about standards today, because I really just want to focus on the concept of emission and what we breathe and what we can do about it. And I hope that will come across. So the weather's always important, we know that, but it's, if you don't have emissions, then you're probably not going to have too much of a problem. So there has to be emissions. We have to really think about where we are in relation to the emissions that we may be subjected to. So couple of quotes here. Lord Kelvin there, it's one of my favorites. To measure is to know. If you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. That's why we have to perform science. That's why we have to perform measurements. So we can understand what's going on, and then maybe we can do something about it. Maybe we can improve the situation. If it's something we don't like, then let's make it better. And breathing is, of course, not optional. So when we think about air quality, we have to think about, really, what do we mean by that? Where are we talking about? Is the air quality good or is it not good? Well, we can look out the window and we can make an estimation. We can see the smoke, for example, at the moment, but one of our problems is when we deal with toxic air pollutants that may be invisible, odorless, and tasteless. And that's when we can maybe run into certain problems where we don't really, let's say, are not fully aware of what we're breathing. Things have got better, certainly in certain areas. This is northern England, somewhere in around the early 1900s, a lot of coal combustion. So we realized this source was pretty bad to be in such close proximity to people, so we removed the source. And so now we don't really have all this home, let's say, domestic coal consumption, certainly in Britain, removed in a lot of countries. Very few countries actually now using coal for, let's say, indoor heating. But therefore we've come a really long way in the developed world. And we can look back really to how we've got to where we are today in terms of the great protections that we've been afforded. We have to go back and thank President Nixon for the EPA, NEPA, and the Clean Air Act, which I won't really go into too much now, but these are the mechanisms which have led to significant improvements in air quality. And here's a couple of quotes here. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. This is from one of my classes, but you can see the dates on the left there. That's 61 AD, 1170, and then 1273. We can see that not a lot of progress was made in Rome in 1,000 years. Archimedes of Rome writes, the relation between city air and country air may be compared to the relation between grossly contaminated filthy air and its clear lucid counterpart. So obviously sometimes that can be reversed, and that's one of the surprises that wintertime ozone has brought to us that I'll be talking about shortly. And there we see our first air quality regulation in 1273, and actually it didn't do the job. It took about another 700 years until we actually got some real action. So I've got 10 points that I'm going to make. They're kind of sequential as a flow of information. So First one, wintertime ozone episodes in Wyoming are caused by emissions from oil and gas development activities. That's a fact. The region in consideration, you can see part of it there in the winter, is really only just has oil and gas activities there. So it was pretty obvious that the problem was local, especially as the problem was related to stagnant conditions, winter, cold, etc. I'm going to run through a few slides just to explain how we got to that realization. So here's a slide. Oh, lots of data points. This is where I had a monitoring station and I measured the precursors for wintertime ozone. Ozone is a secondary pollutant, basically 3 oxygen atoms joined together that can irritate our lungs. And here we can see the precursors that when reacted together create ozone. And if we look at this graph, we can see NOx. These are emissions from combustion, like drill rigs, or let's say pumps or engines in a gas field, or even vehicles. And then we have the non-methane hydrocarbons on that bottom axis. And we can see different levels of ozone by the symbols. And we can see the red triangle there, which is indicating to us we have to have a certain amount of emissions to actually create the ozone. So that really helps us, because it helps us to know if we reduce certain emissions, then we should improve the ozone situation. Whilst that might sound obvious, it's a little bit complicated. We have to be really careful. But what we do know now is that we have to reduce the reactive VOCs or hydrocarbons. Interestingly enough, we can call those BTECs, benzene, toluene, xylenes. And the issue also with these particular components and why they're useful for talking about today is that benzene is a carcinogen, and so or an air toxic. So that's really important for us to understand and to control, since it has can have quite catastrophic effects upon our health. Lisa will be talking about that. So here's a little picture of Wyoming up in the top corner. There's the Upper Green River Basin, and here's some monitoring sites. So a 5-year project up there to really kind of understand the situation, so that we could supply information to regulators, so they could take that information and then do with it as they see fit. So there's where I did a lot of measurements, and then we started to understand about ozone behaviour. We actually started to see ozone form right there in the basin, and then move up and push away through sometimes into the town of Pinedale, a reverse drainage flow. So once we do measurements, then we can improve our understanding. So without measurements, we can't understand what's going on. So this really helped us. So we could say, yes, wintertime ozone is related to the oil and gas activity in the local region. Quite some time ago there, 2009. When you look, you have to look closely. When you look closely, you start to see little things. We performed our monitoring relatively close to the Wyoming DEQ station, but we started to see subtle differences. And hopefully you can see that on this graph here. We have ozone on different days, and we can see BSR represents my monitoring site, and BLDR represents basically the DEQ monitoring station. And they're quite close, and they should be much more similar. So that was quite confusing for us for a little while, until we located a large source of VOC or BTECs, a water treatment facility in the area. And it was a little bit of a surprise to us, but once we started to investigate it, then we realized that it was actually really quite a significant facility in terms of certainly of emissions of air toxics, BTECs compounds. And what I want to just quickly jump back here on this graph, if you look at these really tight correlations, this kind of tells us that the light compounds, the kind of unreactive, boring compounds in natural gas, they're really tightly correlated. So the emission source is common. But the issue we found was for the BTEX compounds, it was all slightly different. So we found this other emission source, and let's call it the anticline disposal, or let's say water treatment facility, and we found it was really close to condensate signature. And so we realized that the water treatment and cleaning the water, as you clean the water, you release the hydrocarbons. And that was a big part, or a big contribution to the wintertime ozone, certainly in 2011, in this situation up in Pinedale. And here's another quick graph. And what I wanted to show you here is that we had these different factors that we could look at from our analysis. Factor 3, the little blue dotted line, is when we're getting that reactive toxic mixture. And as I hope you can see there, we can see that yes, indeed, it's driving some of these spikes in ozone creation. So we really had a good little story that we could actually really see how the actual emissions could result in this wintertime ozone that we're still working to try and control by reducing our VOC emissions from oil and gas sources. But if you don't do measurements and you don't do analysis, you just don't know. So when you do this type of work, so you've got various tools at your disposal, and I think if I just press this button now, you should be able to see this is an infrared camera, a FLIR camera, where I'm just looking at some facilities that I've also potentially done measurements on. So here's one here, it's infrared, so we're seeing a lot of heat as well. But at the end of the pipe, as we move back across, we can see that is an uncontrolled, or we can call it controlled, but it's certainly some emissions getting into the environment that maybe we would not want to see getting into the environment. Maybe those could be looped back through, or maybe they could be burned. You get surprises when you have sensitive equipment. You can be driving along and find suddenly really high values. And here's something in the Uinta Basin that we found. This was on the ground, it was just seeping out the ground. Then we started to find lots of broken pipes. That's not a burning bush, that's a dead bush, because it's been receiving the BTEX there from this particular leakage point. And so again, if you look, then you find, and then when you find, then you decide, do I want to do something about this? And so wintertime ozone really made us realize oil and gas leakage there actually was certainly in the upper green. And then a number of researchers all around the country have gone to really investigate and look and see what the situation is elsewhere. In particular, there's been a lot of aircraft basin flights, a lot of work down in Colorado that Lisa might mention, FRAPE. There's been a number of different aircraft flights where you fly around a basin and you estimate the leakage level. And what people have found is a massive variation. You can go from practically zero leakage to 10%. And that was a big surprise. The big surprise was the worst basin was the one that was measured first. And so now we actually have a better understanding that some basins are really quite good, really low emissions, and other basins can be quite leaky. So it's hard for me to read this since I've got my screen partially covered. So we do understand now that actually EPAM estimates can be plain wrong, especially when we compare it to measurements and actual assessments on the ground. Most importantly, the concept of what type of product we're dealing with is really important. So when we have a wet gas, one that's got more what we would call condensate, or let's say petrol or gasoline kind of components in it, then you're more likely to get leakage, and in particular of BTEX. So the more condensate, the more BTEX you're likely to have released. And when we go from let's say up high in the aircraft where you can't really get any detail, you get down on the ground, then what we've tend to find is pipelines are usually pretty tight, limited leakage, but it's when you get onto the well pads where you've potentially got some pressure changes, and you've got some where you've got to separate water and oil and gas, that's often where you would start to see these emissions. And because of the way dehydration units work on the oil and gas industry, BTEX is sometimes preferentially emitted. So why do we worry about BTEX compounds? Well, they're toxic, as Lisa's going to start talking about, and they can make our rural air quality in some ways far worse than city air quality. And so that's obviously a major concern for people that live in rural areas that anticipate having clean air. And so when you think about what you breathe from any particular activity, or if you're, let's say, downwind from any activity, could be a truck, could be your own car, could be an oil and gas facility. A lot of these will have gone through a permitting process. They will be, let's say, legal in the way they operate. But the point I would like to make is just because it's legal doesn't mean it's okay. And just because it's legal doesn't mean it's safe. There's always a compromise when we're thinking about economic activity and environmental protection. And I've got an analogous story here that I want to quickly tell. And this is about human exposure, but about the London Underground. London in the UK, major world city, totally economically dependent upon the underground network. You can see a picture of it on the left there, and you can see the little map on the right. I tasked myself with a new instrument to sneak through the London Underground, and I found this. This is particulate matter. We've got micrograms per cubic meter on the left, and we have some designations of different locations there that I've moved through on this journey. And what I want to point out here is the busy streets. If we look at the busy streets in the middle, I was standing literally in the middle. It was a little bit dangerous of the most busy street in London to get those busy street measurements. I was really surprised to see how high the measurements were inside the London Underground. And guess what? That emission can't be controlled. I did subsequent measurements and I had discussions with the Mayor of London, and they basically couldn't really do anything about it. So it's an uncontrolled source, known but uncontrolled. Here's that journey. But now, I have to admit it, I did used to smoke. I went into a public house. There were 10 other people smoking. That puts those levels in context. Smoking is now illegal in indoor areas in most of, well, in all of you, pretty much all of Europe. So sometimes we decide to control the source. Sometimes we decide we are not going to control the source. And there are a number of reasons behind our decision making. So when we think about our exposure and we think about where we're living, one thing I would say is that if we're in an area where there are pollution emissions, especially if those pollution emissions are relatively stable, then at night the atmosphere tends to become much calmer and much more, let's say, squeezed down. And so we can potentially get greater exposure if we're quite close to an emission source. And when we think about emission sources, one point I'd like to make is that even maybe a small emission source might not seem like it would have a big impact, but maybe when we add them together, those little impacts can be quite magnified. So that's me with my quick run through and my jokey slide at the end there. That's what we want, right? We want to be able to have the cleanest air that we possibly can so that we don't have to worry about any toxic impacts upon our body. And I'm going to stop there and hope that Lisa is going to truly explain to us how, when we get those emissions into our body, what the impacts may actually be.
And Commissioner Heath, do you want to step in and introduce Dr. McKenzie real fast?
I was just getting ready to do that. Dr. McKenzie is an assistant professor at the Colorado School of Public Health on the University of Colorado Denver's Anschutz Medical Campus. and has been a lead researcher on impacts of oil and gas on human health and safety in northern Colorado. In a 2018 study, McKinsey and her co-researchers found that air pollutant concentrations increased with proximity to oil and gas facilities, as did health risks along the Colorado Northern Front Range. The study evaluated long and short-term exposure to non-methane hydrocarbons, such as benzene and other hazardous air pollutions. Dr. McKinsey.
Okay, thank you. Can you all see my screen?
Looks good.
Okay, let me get slideshow going here. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me back to talk this year. I enjoyed talking to you about the health effects of oil and gas last year. And thank you, Commissioner Heath, for that introduction. What I want to talk to you about today is going to be, first of all, the current state of the science that we have on health effects. So it's going to be a little bit of a review of what I presented last year, and then get more into what is happening with Colorado's rules and cover a little bit of what Mr. Putnam was going to discuss. And I won't do it as well as he does, but I think it will be interesting for you to see what we're thinking about as the rules are being changed here in Colorado. And particularly, I'm going to be talking about our setbacks and how this is evolving. So to explore the current state of the science, the exposure studies. So this is using information that Robert just explained to you, looking at ambient measurements of air pollutants. And what these have shown us is that these BTEX compounds, benzene, toluene, and other benzene-like compounds and alkanes are emitted from the oil and gas well pads. And occasionally they reach concentrations in the air, particularly near the well pads, that exceed minimal risk levels, or levels at which health effects can occur. And these health effects can range from things like respiratory effects to things as serious as increased risk for cancer. We also, through the measurements we've been taking, we know that the particulate matter concentrations at approximately 1,000 feet from homes, so our measurements are taken 1,000 feet from a well site at homes, they increase during particular well development activities. And while here in Colorado we haven't noticed anywhere near the levels that Dr. Field was showing you for the London Underground, they are fluctuating with the oil and gas activities. We also in Colorado have attributed increased regional ground level ozone to oil and gas activities. And this is for everyone in the region. It's not just necessarily people really close to the well sites, it's for everyone living in the general area. So for example, people living in Denver are being impacted by those ozone precursors and increased ground level ozone in Denver from oil and gas. And then the other one for the exposure that we've been looking at is noise. And up to this point, I've been talking about chemicals, but we've also measured noise at 1,000 feet from that homes that were 1,000 feet from the well sites. And we found that those noise levels pretty consistently through all phases of the development are at levels that can affect sleep and cardiovascular health. So we've taken that data, and there have been 2 studies now in Colorado that have been published. And in these, they're risk assessment studies. So we take those concentrations in the air and we say, well, if someone was exposed to that concentration, what would be their risk for some health effects? And one of the studies was a study we did at the Colorado School of Public Health, and the other was done by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. They hired a consultant to do this for them. And both the studies have found, seeing that acute short-term health risks begin to increase at approximately 2,000 feet from oil and gas well sites and rapidly increase as that distance becomes shorter. And these health risks include things like risk for respiratory disease, neurological effects, irritation. And these health risks are driven by those exposures to benzene and alkanes. And I want to stop a minute and talk about acute health risks. So what we were seeing was occasional spikes in benzene concentrations over time. So we would have, like, for an hour, the benzene concentration would go up, usually in the early morning hours when the atmosphere was very still, no wind, it was very calm, much of what Dr. Field was telling you. And then it would go back down as the air column moved up and things become more diluted. We've also noticed that the cancer risk does increase at shorter distances from the well site, but it still remains below the environmental protection's upper bound of 1 excess cancer for every 10,000 people. We also know, and this is just a real quick summary of about 30 studies that have been published now on epidemiological studies that have been published on health effects. A lot of studies now on self-reported complaints of nosebleeds, dizziness, migraines, headaches, and skin rashes for people living particularly close to oil and gas well sites. And then all the conditions I have listed here, so asthma, congenital heart defects, low birth weights, preterm birth, cardiovascular disease indicators. People with these conditions are more when we look at them, are more likely to be living nearer the oil and gas well sites than further away from them. So that was some chemicals and noise. The other thing is we have a few studies out looking at accidents around these well sites. And when we think about health, we think about, complaining about nosebleeds and things, but there's also this big safety concern. So incidents, like at any other industrial site, incidents can happen on oil and gas well sites, and they have happened, and they have resulted in economic loss, environmental harm, injuries, and fatalities. And I have a picture of one of these sites where there was an explosion on the site in 2015 in Greeley, Colorado. More famously and unfortunately in Colorado, we had a very unfortunate incident where an improperly capped line caused a home to explode. The methane was trapped in the basement, and the occupants went to relight a pilot light, and that resulted in the loss of 2 lives and significant injuries to the other person that was in the home. So how often do those kinds of accidents happen? Well, we did do a study where in Colorado between 2006 and 2015, there were 116 fires and explosions reported in Colorado. So that's about 0.03% of active wells. So it's not common, but it is a catastrophic event when it does happen. There was a higher reporting rate in Utah, which makes us think the Colorado number might be a little underreported. And we found that with those explosions occurring, the average number of homes within 1 mile was about 31 homes, and the range was from anywhere from 0 to 810 homes. So this is an important thing to consider when you're thinking about how close oil and gas wells should be to homes. So that brings me into thinking about how in Colorado are we considering public health and the regulation of oil and gas development. And I'm going to be using these setback distances as an example. So what should it be? And if any of you have been following at all what's been happening in Colorado, you know that this has been a hotly contested subject for several years now. And in 2013, the current setback distances were set based on spills, odors, noise, dust, and lighting, so things that they called nuisance concerns and safety risks to the public, but there wasn't a lot of data behind that. They set the minimum setback distance between an oil and gas well and a home at 500 feet. And for schools, they set that distance at 1,000 feet. So that is what it is right now in Colorado, but that's about to probably change. This is what the head of our Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission said at the time that they increased the setback distance to 500 feet. Okay, so they thought this would be a good way to eliminate a lot of the complaints around the sites and the nuisance complaints, but they didn't factor in any of the air emissions into the setback distance. So last year what happened was in our legislature, they passed a bill called Senate Bill 181, which changed the mission of our Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. In the old rules, the mission of the commission was to foster the responsible, balanced development and utilization of our natural resources in a manner that was consistent with the protection of public health. The new rule is really a sea change. It is requiring the commission to regulate the development and production of the natural resource in a manner that protects public health, safety, and welfare. So now what are they saying about setback distances? So this is what this is Jeff Roberts, who was last year was the director of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation, and now he's a chair of the commission. And it's his take on this is that Senate Bill 181 is mandating them to use the best science that they have to determine what setback distance is most protective of public health. And I have his direct quotes here, so I was paraphrasing that a little bit. So let's look at this visually. This is our current situation in Colorado. So here we have the 500-foot setback distance, and that is from a well to a property boundary of an occupied building, okay? And that's set for if it's a few homes. We also have this distance of 1,000 feet, and that's for schools and for larger housing developments. I believe the number is more than 26 homes. It's very, very specific how they wrote this, and that is what it is right now. And then I've also put on this where we have current data. So we know right now that noise is exceeding levels that can impact health at 1,000 feet from the well site. We also know at that distance that particulate matter can increase. Further from the well site, out here around 2,000 feet, we know that that's when we begin to see the risk for acute health effects increase. We know that those accidents have a wider range than 1,000 feet. And we know people further than 1,000 feet have complaints about irritation, nosebleeds, rashes, noise, and odors. So what they're proposing in the new rule is a 2,000-foot setback distance for everyone. So if it's a single home, schools, subdivisions, and this 2,000 feet, you can see better captures that range of current scientific observations. However, I am going to caveat this with saying that we have not made a lot of measurements on noise and some of the air pollutants out here further away from the site. So we're not, this is not a hard line from the scientific perspective, popping forward. And the other important change in the setback distance is it's no longer from the well, it's from the edge of the well site itself. So that's where they start in measuring the setback distance. So that's what they're proposing right now. This is currently under debate, and this is why John Putnam is not talking to you about this right now, because he's sitting in those hearings right now. However, unless, those are the rules, unless, these are the caveats that they have in place. Okay, so if the residential building unit owners and tenants, so this would include renters, and high occupancy building unit owners and tenants came to an agreement with informed consent that oil and gas site could be closer to the building. If they were under some sort of comprehensive area plan, there might be some relaxing of that 2,000-foot boundary. Instead of drawing it from the edge of the well pad, they are going to consider to allow them to draw it from a particular tank or separator or other equipment on the well pad, instead of the boundary. So let's say that they have a boundary on their site between the equipment and the boundary of their site, then they might be able to start drawing it from a particular piece of equipment. Or they find that they have equipment and other things on the site that will adequately protect the public health, safety, welfare, environment, and also disproportionately impacted communities. And I'm not talking about the disproportionately impacted communities in this talk, but we've also been putting, they're also considering language in the rules of how to handle disproportionately impacted communities. So with that, I will stop and open this to questions. Thank you for your attention.
Commissioner Heath, were you able to receive the questions I sent to you over email?
Yes, I do have them.
Awesome. Well, feel free to kick it off whenever you're ready.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to let the panelists jump in on whichever question they feel like maybe applies to them. And I'm going to start with the first one that we have. Will you be testing beyond 2,000 feet to gauge health effects at that distance?
I'll go ahead and take that one first. We hope to. So we're currently seeking funding to do just that.
Beyond 2,000 feet, we have a lot of information. We've done a lot of measurements in the scientific community where we have taken mobile laboratories with fast response instrumentation, and we've done a number of, let's say, just driving down roads, whether they be residential or in an oil and gas field. And so we often, let's say, have measurements of exactly beyond 2,000 feet, but it's what do we do with those measurements? So sometimes they're just concentration values. So we can say, wow, those measurements are really high there. What does that mean? Well, that's when we have to do what we call an emission flux measurement, where we will park the fast response instruments in our laboratory and then quantify how much, let's say, mass is being released. So we have a lot of measurements that show how much the concentration of air toxics around us. So there is information there. So I just want to put that out there, that when we measure benzene in ambient air, then really we're doing a health assessment in a way, because we're estimating exposure. But here's the thing, there's very limited amounts of ambient measurements of benzene because it's not required by the Clean Air Act. For example, in Europe, it is required by the Clean Air Act. So in the US, we're in a difficult, interesting situation where we are not controlling in ambient air for air toxics. We control them from emission sources. You might think you're not within 2,000 feet of something, but you may well be. You just might not see it. Sometimes what we might measure 2,000 feet away, we might not necessarily be able to say to you, if you're 2,000 feet away from a well, you're safe. You may or may not be, depends on how big the emissions are from that point. It's really complicated, so you have to make compromises. And so that's where we get to these feet and all the rest of it. They're nonsense, right? Ultimately, 6 feet for COVID, you're having a laugh. They're just arbitrary, but they do offer a degree of protection. That's why the 2,000 feet is there.
Dr. Field, I have a question that is somewhat related to this. When you do your testing on your emission levels, do you see any kind of a variation in those emission levels when your humidity is either higher or lower. I'm thinking of a foggy day, cold foggy day versus a real warm, dry day when our humidity is much lower.
Yes, is the simple answer to that question. When we do a plume measurement, let's just pretend where we are by a leaky well or whatever facility we're by. Our ability to measure from that well would be a function of the atmospheric conditions. The wind has to blow towards us, number one. And number two, that air column needs to not blow over the top of our measurement facility, i.e. our measurement van. So we have to really define our distance from what we're trying to measure. And so we take into account issues of whether that it's foggy or calm, etc., for us to do a valid emission flux measurement. And so we have to take into account those conditions. What we do know is that sometimes when the air is still, we can't get a good flux measurement. But what we will find are the measurements that ambient concentrations will go a lot higher because the air is just pooling and just sloshing around in the particular location where we are. And you'll see that just look when you look outside and you look at the conditions around you in the winter, you'll start to see a big difference. Let's say in the smoke plumes in different towns and cities in Wyoming, you can see that. So yes, the concentrations will be potentially higher when it's a foggy day because dispersion is poor. We find it difficult to measure the sources under those conditions, but we can certainly measure the concentrations, and they can be quite high under those conditions.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question that's kind of rolling around in my head. I'm going to have to get it formed yet, which would be kind of a follow-up. But let's move on to our audience questions. The second question is, what suggestion do you have for Wyoming DEQ to improve their air monitoring and strengthen their enforcement?
I'll answer that one first because that's really an easy one for me. I would say I'm actually really impressed with Wyoming DEQ's Wyoming VisNet air monitoring network. It's one of the best coverages that we could have, let's say, for general air quality. So I don't think I really feel in a position to give them any advice on where they should do their sort of routine monitoring. I think they kind of understand that really well. Where, let's say, the universities get involved, like myself and Lisa, are when there are problems that we want to assess related to, let's say, emissions that we're unaware of. So there's a big difference between regulatory monitoring and, let's say, scientific or monitoring. So I try to do scientific monitoring and not get too involved in the regulatory world. But why do I do my monitoring? Because my monitoring can help with respect to ozone. So really, when you have to ask yourself, why are you doing your monitoring? And so I think DEQ knows very well why they're doing their monitoring, because they're trying to conform to the Clean Air Act. And so yeah, that's the difficult question.
Yeah, so when I think about regulation and what regulators need, and this is always an interesting question and not always the easiest question to answer, but I think one thing that's really needed that would help regulators, and I think would help the industry too, is to really understand what processes and equipment are causing these emissions or where the emissions are really coming from. It's not all the well sites are not the same. And it appears that it's certain processes and equipment that are more likely to leak than others, and to really understand that would help with mitigation of the leaks, and that would help both with the air toxics like benzene and also some of the ozone precursors like the BTEX compounds and alkanes. So I think that would be helpful. I think also regulators that we've seen here in our state also really want to know what that gradient or of emissions is for various things off of the well pad. And then I'm going to add, and this is as a scientist, I don't know if the regulators want this or not, but we've really focused on BTEX because that's what we have measured and that's what we can measure. It doesn't mean that there aren't other air pollutants out there that maybe we should be concerned with. We just don't know. They haven't been measured. There are others that have been suggested that could be being emitted, things like some of the aldehydes and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. There haven't been good measurements of those at this point in time. And all of those are associated with health effects and some of the things that people have complained about, particularly for the aldehydes.
Lisa, thank you for that. You just reminded me of something I really should say. So I've measured tons of facilities. I've seen that you can go to one facility with exactly the same equipment, and you can have one facility that's got next to no emissions, and the next facility along has very high emissions. And so you have to ask yourself the question, why is that? And then the answer is pretty simple. Either there's been a mechanical problem, or maybe the maintenance isn't very good, or whatever. And so then you have to work out, well, how do I know about that? And then how do I fix that? And so that's why there are regulations. We can thank Colorado for that, in some ways, for the LDAR programs, leak detection and repair. Industry knows where the leaks are, and so do the scientists now. And then the question is, what do we do about those known leakage points? The biggest issue is dehydration of wet gas. Why is that a big issue? Because you've often got highly pressurized product coming up, and it has to step down in pressure, and then it has to have separation. And it's almost impossible to avoid emissions at that point, but it's what people do with those emissions. Are you going to burn that emission, the BTEX emission from the glycol handling, or are you going to recycle it, or are you just going to vent it? And those are decisions that you can make at the local level that can be informed by regulations that may be from the Oil and Gas Commission, or from let's say, could be the BLM, whoever the regulatory authority is. So that's the challenge, that we kind of know where some of the emissions are coming from, but it requires buy-in from everybody to work out how we can actually reduce those emissions. Jonah Energy has been very, very, let's say, proactive in Wyoming with using drones and having actual measurements on drones, as we would see by NCAR scientists and others. There are some industrial players that are actually really motivated to improve and clean up their operations because they are owned by hedge funds. How does that help us with regulating this? Self-regulation in many industries doesn't work. So we have to have, let's say, government regulations so that we have that level playing field. No emissions is really difficult, but massively reducing emissions is possible if you're required to do so. We can put the setbacks to 2,000 feet, and I'm all for that. But if we don't combine that with really properly controlling the emission sources on the well pads, we're wasting our time. I really feel that we should have strong regulations on the well pads.
Okay, our next question is most air quality rules don't seem to take into account multiple sources like many well pads and apply their rules as if there are not multiplied bad effects to their emissions. How do you think we can convince rule makers to see the bigger picture?
Well, I'll take that first. So the rule makers, and this kind of follows on from what Robert was just saying. So if you put a 2,000-foot setback, and as the person that asked this question, that's a great point, because there's a lot more wells pads out there than one, and people living in this area are usually living around a lot of well pads. So what's that cumulative effect? And in addition to the well pads, what about the other equipment or sites that are used to support the industry and other sites of air pollution? These are all lead to more cumulative effects. The other thing I would say about the 2,000-foot setback, or any setback distance, it doesn't do anything about the ozone precursors and the formation of ground level ozone. That would go to actual regulating emissions from the well sites. And what motivates Colorado to have regulations on the well sites, the ones that they do have, is being out of compliance for ground level ozone from the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So we have corrective actions in our state to get us into compliance for ozone. We're not in compliance for ozone, particularly this summer. We have not been in compliance for ozone. So that's been a big motivator for our state regulators. So state regulators can very much be motivated by federal regulations and rules and dollars coming in from the federal government.
The only thing I'd add to that is I personally would prefer to see no oil and gas wells in residential areas. But if they are there, then the 2,000-foot setback is, for me, an absolute must. And then combined with that, the particular facility has to be really tightly controlled. And because the little things do add up, right? It is a real issue trying to regulate the small sources, which can actually be tons of emissions over an extended period of time, and not actually that small if you're close to them. And that's really the whole point. Yeah, when it adds up, then it's a really kind of a big number, and it's still significant for ozone modeling and et cetera, et cetera. So that's an Achilles heel, I would say, in the regulatory framework, the small unregulated sources and the grandfathered ones too.
I have a question for either one of you at this point in time. You're talking about a 2,000-foot setback as far as the oil pads are concerned. Do you see any possibility that if you go to a 2,000-foot setback for these oil pads, or even the compressor stations, booster stations, whatever facility it is, do you see, particularly on the well pads, a chance that the industry is going to begin drilling more wells on those pads in order to collect that oil that they would be missing from the areas that they've just moved away from with the 2,000 foot as opposed to a 500 or 1,000 foot setback?
Yeah, so this is actually, I'm not real familiar with how this is done in Wyoming right now, but in Colorado, this has been happening. The sites are actually getting quite large already in Colorado. It's not unusual to see proposed well sites with 40 wells on them. The ones we took the noise measurements and particulate matter measurement, that site was 22 wells. It was right in the middle of a residential area. And I don't think the regulations are driving them that way. I think the horizontal drilling has driven it that way. It's more efficient for them to do this on one site where they have a lot of activity than spreading their activity around. And in some ways, from public health, that might expose a smaller population to all these local effects like the noise, accidents, and hazardous air pollutants. However, for those that are there, they're getting higher exposures.
I don't believe we've got 23 wells on any of the pads yet. I
Okay.
think the most I've seen is 8.
Okay.
Wyoming's a big place, and I've been to a lot of well pads, and we do have some mega pads up in the Upper Green River Basin, 64 wells, I believe, maybe even more than that. When wells go in, they do them not quite like Noah's Ark, but they go in 2 by 2. So they can basically directionally drill, and then they can frack, and they switch between the two. So directional drilling enables these, let's say, less of a landscape impact, and that's perceived to be positive from the point of view of land disturbance, truck traffic, etc., etc. And in some ways, sometimes bigger is better in terms of reducing pollution if you can have a number of different wells. So let's say flowing into one bigger dehydration unit, you will get let's say, in theory, less emissions. But you've also got to bear in mind that there's going to be a lot more oil and gas going through this particular well pad. So in some ways, what you've done is maybe created a more concentrated hotspot as opposed to lots of little smaller ones. In a residential area, I wouldn't like to see wells there anyway, and I certainly wouldn't want to see a mega pad anywhere near a residential area.
do you feel enough peer review research has been conducted to conclude the impact of oil and gas development on public health is real and concerning? Are there still gaps in the research, and if so, what are they?
So I would think there is enough research to say that some of these health impacts are real and concerning. However, there's a lot of gaps in the knowledge, so we're nowhere near done. To date, the epidemiological studies that have been done, they're all coming to similar conclusions, and the risk assessments are coming to similar conclusions. However, when we're doing environmental health, it takes a lot of studies to show that cause and effect, if we can ever show it. That's because I think I might have talked about this last year. If I didn't, I'll just remind you a little bit here, is that we can't put people in laboratories and we can't control everything that's going on around them. I would remind you of how long it took to establish that smoking cigarettes, it causes lung cancer. And
Okay,
how
I'm
many
going to
studies.
take this one on too. So the question was, has there been enough research to define that oil and gas can be harmful for human health? Answer, yes. We know it can harm human health, fact. I tell you what keeps me up at night. I've spent a lot of time in the oil and gas fields, and I've met a lot of oil and gas workers, and I've been on projects with some of them when I was actually tried to work with industry quite successfully in other areas. I worry about their personal exposure. I've never managed to be able to get samplers on these workers. So here's the thing. I'm getting into Lisa's area here. When we're thinking about benzene and other air toxics, where the impact, it's not like someone comes up to you and slaps you in the face, right? You know you've just been slapped in the face. If you've been exposed to, let's say, relatively high levels of BTEX over a particular period of time, you may not manifest your, let's say, health effect, if it be leukemia, for example, until sometime in the future. And by that time, how can we really know, was that benzene molecule that made you ill, was it from the oil and gas, or maybe it was that cigarette you smoked 5 years ago, or was it the traffic, or whatever? So we require scientists like Lisa to track the information that we do have of where people are, where they worked, etc., etc. And it's painstaking work in epidemiology and really complicated, but it works. And eventually we start to see relationships and we see clusters. And we saw this with petrol pump attendants in Italy. It was the main way that we started to really understand leukemia clusters. But we might not see these health effects until later. So if we can get samplers onto, let's say, particular populations that we haven't up to this point, then that might be quite useful moving forward. I would love to work with an oil and gas company and put BTEX personal samplers on all of their personnel, and just to see what the exposure levels are. But I doubt that I will be able to get that project off the ground.
Okay, next question. How are you able to gain traction to get SB 181 passed in Colorado? And when can we try it in Wyoming?
Well, I didn't personally get Senate Bill 181 passed. As I talked about, it's been hotly contested, these setback distances in Colorado for several years now. The year before that was passed, there was a ballot initiative where they wanted the initiative was to set the setback at 2,500 feet, which failed on the vote. What did happen politically in Colorado, I can tell you, is that all three branches of our legislature went to the same party. So governor's office, House, and Senate at the state level are all democratically controlled, and some of the senators from some of our more liberal areas, so Boulder and Laramie County, banded together and sponsored this bill. And I think that if you were interested in knowing more about how that was done and the politics of that, you might want to ask one of those sponsors of the bill to come and discuss that with your group. And that would be Senator Foote was one of the sponsors of the bill, and Senator Finberg.
Okay, thank you. Knowing the differences between Wyoming and Colorado's political landscape, what do you think regulators and decision makers can do to protect public health for populations intermingled with oil and gas development?
Well, I think we've spoken to, I mean, I think it's regulations, protective and consistent regulations, monitoring, so you really know what's going on in a meaningful way. The idea of also where you're putting the wells, really thinking about if they should be going into residential areas. Yeah, I know in Colorado, residential areas have also moved towards the well sites, so this is a complicated issue. It's not as simple as just the well sites going into residential areas. It happens both ways. Those are complicated issues, but to be protective and to ultimately be protective, sometimes I think it might be a good idea to take a pause and look at what's going on so we could figure out how to be more protective, but that's probably not realistic. I don't see that happening. Robert?
This is my opinion, of course. For me, public health is just not a partisan issue. I just don't get it. Human beings are human beings, and we live together and we breathe the air together. And so I just don't understand, right? Who wants to breathe dirty, unhealthy air? Who would want anyone else to breathe dirty, unclean air? So when we think about that, we think about the setbacks. That's a political question. I consider myself an independent arbiter of data, so that's not for me to provide any sort of conjecture on. I guess it just requires that people care, and I think that's maybe jurisdictional for different towns. And I'm going to throw this one back actually to, I know we've got 10 minutes, back to Lisa, but one thing that I've noted is that in Colorado sometimes you might have a town that might have a vote in a particular way about how to manage oil and gas. We don't really see that in Wyoming, is my understanding.
Yeah, in Colorado before Senate Bill 181, there were several localities that tried to pass moratoriums, bans, different things on oil and gas development within their boundaries. And they were largely unsuccessful because the state didn't allow local control. And so those went all the way up to our Supreme Court and were defeated. The only one I know, the only jurisdiction I know that was a little successful with this was Boulder County. But now with Senate Bill 181, they're passing that local control back. They're giving local control to those local jurisdictions, which they're in the throes of interpreting what that means. So some of the local jurisdictions are interpreting that they can do as much development however they want it, whereas I think the sponsors of the bill have clearly stated that was not their intention, that it's supposed to be a floor. So that stay tuned for what's going to happen in Colorado on that. I don't think we know yet. So
yeah, and interesting thing there, Lisa, is that this is something like environmental regulation between nations as well. When you have a level playing field, then basically it's not the race to the bottom, right? So if you have a particular industry, then you won't rush to the country and go there because the environmental regulations are so lax. So that's why we want to have a common, let's say, common ground between all the states, right? Let alone the towns. So that's where we look to our federal government, right? To the actual question that was asked as well, we're asking about what do you do when everything's all mixed up together? That's a big problem because we have this thing called grandfathering, right? Where you can have an older facility that will not, if it went in before a regulation was passed, then it's exempt from that regulation. Am I correct on that one, Lisa?
in some cases, it depends on how they write the law.
Yeah, so before you know it, it's really complicated. And so, yeah, I don't know how you navigate that if you're a landowner, right? I know that's hard.
Okay, we have 3 more questions. I'm going to throw one more out there. Let's see if we can get some real short answers. What is the best advice that you can give to people who live near oil and gas? Go.
Okay, so if you're
Don't
living
breathe.
near you have to breathe. Keep breathing. So if you live near an oil and gas site, the best advice I would give to you is pay attention to what's going on the pad. And if there are things concerning to you or odors, I would just recommend that you find some place else to be at some times. I mean, I know that that's not a real satisfactory answer, but if you're concerned about your health, see if you can get out of there. If you can't, see if you can keep your windows closed, use your air conditioning, change your filters. I don't know how much air conditioning you're using up in Larimer County, but these are some other things that you might be able to do to limit some of your exposures.
Great answer, Lisa. It's difficult and it depends upon an individual's sensitivity too. Some people can be very sensitive and other people less so. And so I think it's down to your sensitivity and then how you feel. That's why in my talk, that's why I talked about the senses as well. Because if when you breathe something and you feel your eyes irritated or your throat or you have a headache, I call them frontal lobe headaches when you get a certain amount of, let's say, air toxic hydrocarbon mix. If you feel that, then you have to avoid it. And if it's something that happens a lot, I'm talking from a personal perspective. As much as I would not want to say this, if I was somewhere where I was breathing air and it was making me feel unwell, I'm afraid I would probably move.
Much like you're experiencing probably in Larimer County right now with all the wildfire smoke. Personally, there are days that I have made the decision, no, I'm not going to go out and take my walk today because the smoke is too thick. My eyes are burning. It's irritating my throat. This isn't good for me.
Dr. Field and Dr. McKenzie, I thank you for your time tonight. According to the clock, it looks like we're getting a little bit close to our deadline. I'll turn it over to Monica for a closing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Commissioner Heath, Dr. McKenzie, Dr. Field. I think it's really been a robust discussion tonight, and it's something that I hope we continue to discuss because I do think one characteristic about Laramie County in general is the amount of oil and gas that is in close proximity to people's homes. So with that, I would just, if anyone wants to take, a 15-second take away any advice to calc moving forward. If you don't have any, you can pass. We'll start with Dr. Field, go to Dr. McKenzie, and then Commissioner Heath.
If you smell pollution that you don't like smelling, move away from it.
My last thing I'd just like to leave with is I would recommend working with your regulators, with your state health department, and seeing what you can do to mitigate some of the situations and have more say in where these wells are located.
I'll look forward to seeing what happens in the future. I know right now that the oil and gas industry is a little bit on the slow side, somewhat depressed. They are opening some of the wells back up in the county. It is slow. We're not seeing as many trucks on the road, but we're also seeing a lot of pipeline construction within the county, which will save our roads because we won't have the trucks. So, lots of things to consider here, lots of things for the industry to be watching as far as their own infrastructure is concerned. But I think if we just all sit down and we can discuss these on a civil level, the concerns that we'll come out with a better product in the end. I'm all for a civil discussion and seeing what can be done. Sometimes some of these solutions are workable and some of them aren't. So, Monica, back to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Commissioner Heath. I agree, and it's just really great to have you here and to be able to have these discussions. And I know that with Calc, we'll continue to have them and help to provide, that landowner voice. So if people are interested in learning more about Calc and what we do, visit our brand new website, CheyenneLandowners.org. It's got a lot of great information on air quality in particular, and what you can do, as well as what is flaring, what is venting, just some educational resources. We appreciate you all being here tonight, and take care, everyone.